welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. According to 538.com, roughly 57% of eligible voters cast ballots this time around, slightly up from 2012, but certainly down from 2008. Now, there were many dissatisfied with their options at the top of the ticket with the presidential choices, and some were actually precluded from voting, either from targeted restrictions aimed at suppressing the vote in certain areas or among certain demographics, or from long lines and faulty voting machines. But was the American election fair and accessible? Well, joining us today is Thomas Rymer. He is the spokesperson for the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which sends trained observers to watch and ensure the integrity of democratic elections all over the world. His agency is a body of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, otherwise known as the OSCE, and he joins us today from Warsaw, Poland. Thomas, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Thomas, if you could, can you explain to us the type of mission that your organization conducted back on November 8th here in the United States?
Well, yes, on November 8th, we had about 300 observers, both from our organization and from the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, who were in about 34 different states in the United States, observing on Election Day, observing opening of polling stations, the voting procedure there, as well as the closing of polling stations. Now, the thing is, our observation mission specifically from our office arrived actually at the beginning of November, because the observation we carry out is not just of what happens on Election Day. Election Day is, of course, important, but there's more to an election than that. So we look at a wide range of aspects of the electoral process: campaign financing, voter registration, candidate registration, the way the media covers the campaign and provides voters with the information they need to make an informed choice. It's an election is much more complex procedure than just what happens on the day people vote.
So what did your group discover about how the American elections were executed?
Well, there's no question. I think everyone saw this. This was a very competitive campaign. It was fought very hard, and was definitely the center of attention for voters. One thing we found that perhaps the rhetoric, particularly on the part of one candidate, in some cases, was I think intolerant, and that was problematic. What we also saw that fundamental freedoms were highly respected. I mean, there was the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. All of these things were protected and were exercised very robustly, if you like, in the election campaign. At the same time, there were definitely what we saw as partisan efforts to affect the registration process. You saw this in court battles, still ongoing in some cases, in different states, where there were real concerns that legislative initiatives that had been introduced had been introduced in such a way as to limit the suffrage, to perhaps in some ways make it more difficult for certain segments of society to vote, certain groups in society.
And how does your findings compare to how other elections around the world have gone? How does the United States rank comparatively?
The thing is, the process, it's a great question and not one for me. And the reason for that is that the purpose of our process, and the reason the OSCE, the United States, like all 57 participating states in the OSCE, has committed itself to invite us to come and observe is because what we do with this process is, one, look at electoral system and see where it meets international commitments, OSCE commitments for elections, and places where it doesn't, so that we can identify both good practices, which we find, and make suggestions where there are perhaps shortcomings where a system can be improved. So there's no such thing as a perfect election. Now, as far as ranking, we're not a rankings agency. We're not a ratings agency, and this isn't like a standings for baseball teams or any other team. What we're specifically focusing on is how, in our assessment of this election, where there may be areas for improvement, so that we can make recommendations on how those things can be improved.
I mean, that's kind of interesting, don't you think? Because I would think that there would be a best country who executes democracy better than others. It's kind of interesting that you don't rank these countries in that way.
Well, I mean, first of all, the thing is we're measuring, the thing is when you're ranking different countries, then it becomes a subjective procedure, I think. What we do is try to objectively assess the electoral process in a country against some very definite standards and definite things. And I mean, the thing isn't to figure out whose election is better and worse. The thing is to improve an election process in any state where we're working. Where it's not you guys win, it's you have elections, there are things you'd like to improve, let us help you do that.
So what are some of the ways that the United States can improve implementing or executing their elections? Because as you said, I mean, you sent your observers to 34 different states. Each state operates somewhat differently. So what?
All of them do.
Right. So
it's like observing 51 elections when you include DC. It's a very complex process in the United States.
Incredible. So what are some of the ways that the United States can improve in how we put on our elections, both nationally, state, and local?
Well, the thing is, we've observed only the general elections in this case. Now, as far as how those improvements can be made, that is something that will come in our final report, which unfortunately will come in about 8 weeks. I mean, what we can talk about now is what comes out of our preliminary statement that provides an assessment of the process we just witnessed. So there's some of the things that I mentioned before, where there are difficulties. You can add to these that while there's a very robust, for example, media environment in the United States and media market, for lack of a better term, the media, much like the campaign itself, were quite polarized. So that you generally had media aligning with one side or another, which brings into question in some cases the objectivity of the work being done by the media. You have issues with regard to gender participation. In the outgoing Congress, I think 20% of the members of the Congress were women. 17% of the congressional candidates in this election were women, so even lower than the number that's there now, although 50% of the presidential candidates, of course, 25%, but one of the two main party candidates was a woman in this election.
Thomas, you mentioned earlier about the ongoing lawsuits filed by different civil rights organizations such as the ACLU and the NAACP, in particular states such as North Carolina and others, about how voter suppression and trying to make it more difficult for certain segments of the population to vote, specifically African Americans and specifically African American Democrats. Do we see these sort of targets at specific groups similarly in other sort of Western industrialized nations? I mean, is this unique to the United States, or do other democracies engage in trying to limit the speech and the accessibility to the ballot box by certain groups, either racial or political groups?
I would. The thing is, there are different considerations always in ensuring an equitable access to the ballot, as well as an import, a weight of the ballot. Now, I don't know if there are specific other countries. I don't want to say that there are or aren't that do it in a specific way that you're talking about. But the cases like gerrymandering, which is essentially a term for drawing electoral boundaries to include more of a certain group or another to try and get a better result for a certain party or certain candidate, that's something we do see in other participating states and is an issue. It's an issue in the United States as well. We've seen a positive movement in recent years in some states to try to hand over the districting, the drawing of district boundaries to independent bodies, as opposed to being controlled by the legislatures in each particular state, which has often been the case in the past. So that's something positive we point out in this report. Again, though, I think I want to stay away from saying, well, does this happen here? Is the United States different? or that. I mean, what we're focusing on here is the U.S. election, and with these commitments. And if there is a partisan real effort to prevent certain groups of voters from voting, that has there are obviously democratic problems with that, and that this has been happening, or quite likely has been happening, has been expressed quite clearly. You mentioned North Carolina. I mean, the ruling there, the judge was very explicit on what, in his ruling, on what he believed the motivation for the legislation to have been.
We've been speaking with Thomas Rymer. He is the spokesperson for the Office of Security and Cooperation in Europe, their Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And he's been joining us today from Warsaw, Poland, talking about the observation of the American elections. And we do await his agency's report forthcoming in a few weeks. Thomas, we appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. Take care.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.